The following Appalachian Mountains horror story is real, disturbing, and should be used as a warning. The names and locations have been altered to protect the individuals involved. Viewer discretion is advised. When Jackson found David sitting against the car tire after 18 hours missing in the Kentucky mountains, he was covered in scratches, missing a boot, and so drugged he couldn't speak. The toxicology report said scopolamine, ketamine, and something the lab couldn't identify. 4 years later, David still works at Costco, still seems fine, except sometimes he whispers things in his sleep that he doesn't remember saying. This happened 4 years ago, and Jackson still thinks about it every single time David goes to the bathroom at work and takes longer than 10 minutes. 4 years, and he still can't shake the feeling that the guy who came back from those mountains wasn't exactly the same David who went in. Back then, Jackson was 24, forklift certified, living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment with a Murphy bed that's stuck halfway up. He met David and William 3 years before the trip, all three of them sitting through the same mind-numbing Costco orientation video. They weren't childhood friends or anything deep like that. They were just three guys who covered each other's shifts, grabbed wings after Saturday inventory, and complained about the same managers. David was the outdoorsy one. Grew up in rural Kentucky, owned actual camping gear that didn't come from Walmart, talked about trails like other people talked about TV shows. William was the anxious one. Overthinker, hand sanitizer in his pocket, the guy who Googled bear attack statistics before agreeing to anything. And Jackson? Jackson was the people pleaser, the guy who said yes to plans he didn't want to do because saying no felt worse. So when David pitched the camping trip over beers one night in late April, real camping, just us, no RV parks, no families with screaming kids, actual wilderness, Jackson said yes. Because he was 24 and tired of his life being nothing but work, sleep work. And he wanted one memory that didn't involve a scanner gun and fluorescent lights. William only agreed because his girlfriend had just dumped him via text, and spending Memorial Day weekend alone watching her new Instagram stories with some other guy sounded worse than 3 days in the woods with ticks and no Wi-Fi. They packed David's hand-me-down gear into Jackson's hatchback on a Thursday morning. Jackson's sleeping bag smelled like his dad's garage, motor oil, and old canvas. William showed up wearing a brand-new North Face jacket he'd bought specifically for this trip and would never wear again. David brought a printed Google Maps screenshot and a confidence that, looking back, should have been the first red flag. The drive took 4.5 hours, deep into the Appalachian backcountry of eastern Kentucky. The trailhead wasn't a parking lot with bathrooms and a ranger kiosk. It was a dirt pullout off a county road, marked only by a faded wooden sign with a hand-painted trail name that was barely legible. No other cars, no trash cans, no cell service. Not one bar, not even searching, just that empty little icon where the signal should be. David grinned. "This is the point, boys, off the grid. Real camping." Jackson stood there in the gravel looking at the wall of trees ahead of them and felt his stomach twist in a way he couldn't explain. Not fear, exactly. Just a quiet, animal brain whisper that said, "Turn around." But he didn't say anything, because David seemed fine, and Jackson didn't want to be the guy who ruined the trip by being paranoid. The forest swallowed them the second they stepped past that trailhead sign. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. 1 second they were standing in sunlight on gravel. The next, they were surrounded by trees so dense the canopy blocked out half the sky. These weren't the pretty postcard mountains you see in travel brochures. These were old mountains, ancient. The trees grew at weird angles, twisted by centuries of wind and erosion, and the undergrowth was thick with rhododendron that hadn't been trimmed back in decades, maybe ever. The trail was narrow, barely maintained, marked by the occasional faded orange blaze spray-painted on a tree trunk, and even those were hard to spot if you weren't paying attention. They hiked for 3 hours without seeing another person. No day hikers, no trail runners, not even old boot prints in the mud. Just the three of them and their packs and the sound of their breathing. Around mile 3, William stopped to adjust his pack straps and said, "Anyone else notice there's, no birds?" Jackson looked up, listened. William was right. No bird song, no crows, no woodpeckers hammering on bark. Nothing. David shrugged it off. It's midday. Birds are quiet midday. But it wasn't just birds, it was everything. No insects buzzing, no squirrels rustling in the branches, no wind moving through the leaves, just their boots on dirt and the occasional crack of a stick underfoot. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat. The kind that made you lower your voice without meaning to, like you were in a library or a funeral home. By mile 5, Jackson's gut was screaming at him that something was off. Not dangerous necessarily, just wrong. Like the forest was holding its breath. But he didn't say anything, because David seemed totally fine, navigating by memory and his phone's offline GPS like he'd done this 100 times. And Jackson didn't want to be the guy who got scared of a quiet forest. They set up camp just before sunset in a small clearing David swore he'd camped in before. "Right here," David said, dropping his pack. "I remember that tree. Did this exact spot with my uncle when I was 16. But there was no fire ring, no cleared ground, no flattened dirt where tents had been pitched before. The clearing looked untouched. Wild." Jackson didn't say that either. They pitched their tents, boiled water for dehydrated chili mac, and sat around a campfire that felt too loud in all that quiet. William kept glancing over his shoulder at the dark tree line. David told a story about a black bear he'd seen on another trip. Jackson barely listened. He was too busy noticing the way the firelight didn't seem to reach very far, like the darkness was pressing in harder than it should. At 10 p.m., they decided on a watch rotation. 2-hour shifts, just in case. Jackson took first watch. He made it 45 minutes before he woke David early, hands shaking, unable to put into words why he felt like his skin was crawling. David sat up, groggy, annoyed. "Did you see something?" "No." "Did you hear something?" Jackson exhaled through his nose. "That's the problem. I didn't hear anything, at all." David stared at him for a second, then crawled out of his tent and took over the watch without another word. Jackson tried to sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag with his eyes open, listening to the absolute nothingness outside the tent, and felt his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. At some point, he drifted off. He dreamed about drowning in a lake where the water made no sound. By day 2, 3 p.m., they'd been hiking for 9 hours straight, and Jackson was pretty sure they were lost. David kept insisting they were almost there, that the ridge was just over the next rise, that he recognized that rock formation, that the trail would loop back any minute now. But the landmarks he was describing didn't match anything they were actually seeing. William's feet were destroyed, blisters on top of blisters, limping every third step. Jackson's knees were screaming, and the silence was so oppressive now that they'd stopped talking entirely. Conversation felt like an intrusion, like speaking too loud might wake something up. Jackson finally called for a break. "We need to stop just for 10 minutes. They dropped their packs in a small clearing. William immediately collapsed onto his back, arm draped over his eyes, groaning. Jackson dug out the last of the trail mix, mostly just peanut dust and a few sad raisins, and tried to ration it. David didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees with that same fixed, listening expression he'd had all morning. His head was cocked. His lips were slightly parted. His whole body was angled toward something Jackson couldn't see. After about 5 minutes, David said quietly, "I'll be right back." Jackson looked up, mouth full of trail mix. "Where are you going?" "Just need to take a piss, 2 seconds." William didn't even react. He just lay there, dead to the world. Jackson nodded. "Don't go far. We need to figure out where the hell we are." David smiled, but it wasn't his normal smile. It was distant, distracted, like he was hearing a joke Jackson wasn't in on. "Yeah," David said, "I'll be right back." And then he walked into the trees. Not toward any particular landmark, not toward a visible path or a tree to pee behind, just straight into the undergrowth, moving with a calm, purposeful stride that didn't match someone who needed to take a quick bathroom break. Jackson watched him disappear into the foliage, counted to 60 in his head. Then another 60. At 3 minutes, he felt the first flicker of unease. At 5 minutes, he stood up. "David?" No answer. At 7 minutes, William sat up, blinking groggily. "Where'd he go?" "Bathroom, but it's been 7 minutes. At 10 minutes, they started calling his name. Their voices were swallowed by the silence. No echo, no response, just dead air. At 15 minutes, Jackson's hands started shaking. They went looking. The boot prints were easy to find at first, clear impressions in the soft dirt heading northeast, away from the clearing. They followed them, crackling through underbrush, calling David's name over and over until their throats were raw. The prints were deep, steady, not the prints of someone stumbling or running, the prints of someone walking with purpose, like David knew exactly where he was going. But after 100 yards, the prints just stopped. Not gradually, not like David had stepped onto rock or changed direction. They just ended, mid-stride, in the middle of a patch of wet leaves. Jackson crouched down, touched the last print with his fingertips. It was fresh, deep. The edges were still sharp. David had taken a step here, and then he'd ceased to exist. "What the fuck?" William whispered, his voice cracking. "What the fuck, Jackson?" They searched in expanding circles, screaming themselves hoarse. They checked behind trees, in ditches, under fallen logs. They looked for scuff marks, for signs of a struggle, for anything. William started hyperventilating, saying they needed to call for help, fumbling for his phone even though they both knew there was no service. As the sun started to drop, 4 p.m., then 5 p.m., then 6 p.m., Jackson had to make a decision. Keep searching in the dark with failing flashlights, or set up camp and wait for daylight. He chose to wait. They hiked back to the clearing where David had disappeared, set up their tents with shaking hands, and built a fire. The first real sound they'd heard in 2 days that felt alive. Crackling, popping, real. Jackson didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, feeding it sticks, staring into the black wall of trees, and wondered if David was out there somewhere, staring back. At 3 a.m., he heard something. Not whistling, not voices, just a single distant sound, a branch snapping. Then another. Rhythmic, deliberate, footsteps coming closer. He grabbed William's shoulder, shook him awake. They sat shoulder to shoulder by the fire, staring into the dark, waiting for something, someone, to step into the light. The footsteps got closer, closer, and then they stopped. right at the edge of the firelight, just beyond where they could see. Jackson's voice came out as a whisper. "David?" No answer. The footsteps retreated, slowly, deliberately, fading into the silence until there was nothing left but the crackle of the fire and the hammering of Jackson's heart in his ears. At first light, they searched again. 6 hours. Methodical, desperate. They covered every inch of ground within a half-mile radius of where the boot prints had ended. They called David's name until their voices gave out entirely, reduced to hoarse croaks. They looked for broken branches, disturbed leaves, fabric caught on thorns, anything that would tell them which direction he'd gone. Nothing. No boot prints. No signs of struggle. No blood. No torn clothing snagged on bushes. David had walked 100 yards into the forest and then simply stopped existing. At 9 a.m., Jackson made the call. "We have to go back," he said, voice flat. "Dead. We hike to the trailhead. We get to a ranger station. We report him missing. That's all we can do." William nodded immediately, nearly sobbing with relief. Okay. Yes. We need help. We can't." "I know." They packed up David's gear, his tent, his sleeping bag, his camp stove, everything except the clothes he'd been wearing and the boots on his feet. Jackson shouldered David's pack along with his own, the extra weight digging into his shoulders, and they started the hike back. The hike out took half the time it should have. The trail seemed clearer, the markers more visible, like the forest had been holding them in place for 2 days, and now that David was gone, it was letting them go. And that terrified Jackson more than anything, the idea that they'd only been lost because something wanted them lost. They reached the trailhead at 1 p.m. Jackson's hatchback was still there, parked in the dirt pullout exactly where they'd left it. The doors were unlocked. Jackson was sure he'd locked them, but he didn't trust his memory anymore, didn't trust anything. And sitting on the ground beside the driver's side door, back propped against the front tire, filthy and unresponsive, was David. Jackson's brain didn't process it at first. He just stood there 10 feet away, staring, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what made sense. Then it hit him, a flood of relief so intense it nearly knocked him to his knees. He sprinted to David, dropped to a crouch, grabbed his shoulders, shook him hard. "David! David, where the fuck were you? We've been looking for you for 18 hours. David didn't respond. His eyes were half open but glassy, unfocused, staring at nothing. His face was slack. Drool glistened at the corner of his mouth, catching the sunlight. His clothes were shredded, shirt torn at the shoulder, jeans ripped at both knees, exposing scraped, dirt-caked skin underneath. His hands were caked in grime, fingernails black with what looked like soil or dried blood. Scratches crisscrossed his forearms in thin red lines. His right boot was missing. One sock was soaked through with something dark that might have been blood. He smelled like sweat and piss and something else, something sharp and chemical, like cleaning solution or hospital disinfectant. Jackson slapped his face lightly. "David! David! Can you hear me? It's Jackson. You're safe. You're at the car. Can you hear me?" David's eyes drifted toward him, slow and unfocused. His mouth moved, shaping soundless words. His pupils were blown wide, black swallowing the brown of his irises entirely, like he'd been staring into a bright light for hours. He wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't there. He was somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. "I'm calling 911, William said, voice shaking, already running back toward the road. Jackson stayed with David, trying to get him to drink water, trying to get him to speak, to blink, to do anything that looked like awareness. David's head kept lolling to the side. His eyes kept rolling back. Every few seconds, his lips would move again, just barely, like he was trying to whisper something but couldn't get the muscles to cooperate. And then, suddenly, David's hand shot out and grabbed Jackson's wrist. His grip was weak, trembling, but desperate. His eyes focused, really focused, like he was surfacing from deep underwater for just 1 second. And he whispered, voice cracked and raw. I heard it, I followed it, I couldn't stop. Jackson leaned in, heart hammering. Followed what? David, what happened to you? Where were you? David's eyes lost focus again. His hand dropped limp to his side, and he didn't speak again. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. 2 paramedics, mid-30s, calm and professional in a way that made Jackson feel like he was watching a TV show instead of living through this. They loaded David onto a stretcher, checked his pupils with a penlight, checked his pulse. One of them muttered to his partner, "Tox screen's gonna be interesting." They asked Jackson if David had a history of drug use. Jackson said no. They asked if he'd taken anything on the trip, mushrooms, pills, anything. Jackson said no, absolutely not. They'd barely even had beer. The paramedic gave him a look that said he didn't believe it. At the hospital, 3 hours later, Jackson sat in a waiting room that smelled like bleach and stale coffee, while a doctor, young, tired, wearing scrubs with cartoon frogs on them, explained the toxicology results. Scopolamine, ketamine, and trace amounts of a benzodiazepine the lab couldn't fully identify. It's consistent with chemical submission, the doctor said carefully. The kind of cocktail you'd use in an assault or a kidnapping. Someone drugged him, deliberately, with precision. Jackson stared at her. How? We were in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else out there. The doctor had no answer. The Rangers searched the area where David disappeared. They brought dogs. They brought drones. They hiked the same trail Jackson and William had hiked, checked the clearing, checked the spot where the boot prints ended. They found nothing. No camps, no tracks, no evidence of other people, no explanations. The official report listed it as suspected accidental drug exposure, source unknown. 4 years later, Jackson is 28, assistant manager at Costco. David still works the same shift. They're still friendly. They still grab lunch in the break room sometimes. David doesn't remember what happened. The doctors called it drug-induced retrograde amnesia, the brain's way of protecting itself from trauma. He remembers packing for the trip, remembers the drive, remembers setting up camp the first night and then nothing. 18 hours just gone. The toxicology report confirmed scopolamine, ketamine, and an unidentified benzodiazepine. Chemical submission. Someone drugged him deliberately, with precision. The Rangers searched the area, brought dogs, brought drones, found nothing. No camps, no tracks, no evidence of anyone else being out there. The official report: suspected accidental drug exposure, source unknown. Jackson knows what the internet says. Drug manufacturers using the backcountry as lab space, human traffickers testing product on hikers, survivalist cults, feral people who were never documented, or just locals who saw 3 out-of-towners and decided to mess with them in the worst way possible. David has no theories. David doesn't remember. And the 2 times Jackson tried to bring it up, David's face went blank and he changed the subject. So Jackson stopped asking. 2 months ago, Jackson was restocking paper towels when he heard it. A low whistle. 2 notes. Alternating. His whole body went cold. It was David. 3 aisles over, stocking batteries, whistling under his breath. The same 2 notes, over and over. Jackson walked over. "Were you just whistling?" David frowned. "Was I?" He shrugged. "I don't think so. Why?" Jackson didn't answer. He just walked away, hands shaking. David's fine, except he's not. And Jackson knows it. 4 years later, the mountains are still there. Still silent. Still waiting. And somewhere deep in those woods, something is still whistling. 2 notes over and over, calling.